I want to return to the theme we were talking about last time, which is really the developments of the 1930s that lead up to the Second World War. We were describing the financial circumstances, the hyperinflation in Germany, and then the Dawes Plan, which essentially involved the Allies loaning Germany the money to pay them back. Churchill summarizes all of this in the following way. He says, on the contrary, whereas about 1,000 million pounds of German assets were appropriated by the victorious powers, more than 1,500 millions were lent a few years later to Germany, principally by the United States and Great Britain, thus enabling the ruin of the war to be rapidly repaired in Germany. As this apparently magnanimous process was still accompanied by the machine-made howlings of the unhappy and embittered populations in the victorious countries, and the assurances of their statesmen that Germany should be made to pay to the utmost farthing, no gratitude or goodwill was to be expected or reaped. Germany only paid or was only able to pay the indemnities later extorted because the United States was profusely lending money to Europe and especially to her. History will characterize all these transactions as insane. They helped to breed both the Marshall Curse and the economic blizzard, of which more later. So he sees all of this as really crazy and leading to many of the problems that arose. Well, last time near the end we were talking some about the ideas that lay behind all of these problems. We were talking some about Kant's idea of a kingdom of ends and how that gets taken in a way that Kant never intended by the Nazis, who think of the Reich as something that involves a shared end, a common goal, in a much more radical sense than Kant ever envisioned. We were talking about some of the ideas of Nietzsche that got twisted by the Nazis for their own particular purposes. In Nietzsche, there's a stage of development which is like this. It gets superseded by other stages. But Hitler takes one of these stages and seizes upon it as a justification for a championing of strength and really villainy. Now, the one thing we didn't get time to talk about is this thing at the very end, the question of civilization versus culture. That's an important distinction for the Nazis, and one that I think doesn't make a lot of intuitive sense to us, at least initially. But why is it important? In fact, one writer has said that a hatred of Jews and of Judaism is really a hatred of civilization. And indeed, in many of Hitler's writings and in other Nazi theorists, there's this resentment against civilization. In fact, you find it even in Freud, in his book Civilization and Its Discontents, where he says, we each have desires. Civilization constrains us. It makes possible a certain kind of cooperation by forcing some of our desires down, suppressing them, making it impossible for us to do what we want and be the kinds of people we want to be. And so culture is supposedly the expression of the people we truly are inside. Civilization is viewed as this thing that is putting a lid on us, capping us. And so there's a natural hostility toward it, and the Nazis basically champion culture against that idea of civilization. We talked about some of its manifestations last time. I want to talk about how it actually led to Hitler's rise to power. There was a strong feeling of nationalism in Germany and in a variety of other countries after World War I. It was partly because the intensity of the conflict led to an intensity of allegiance to one's homeland. It was partly an expression of the ideology in Wilson's 14 points that any people ought to be recognized as having rights collectively, and that people ought to be allowed a right of self-determination in particular. There was resentment at the injustice of the Treaty of Versailles. There was a sort of rewriting the map, except for Germany, really to try to allow for this sort of self-determination. In Germany's case, of course, lots of people who spoke German and were ethnically German were excluded from Germany as it was reduced by 13%. And then within Germany, there was a lot of political division. There was street violence, largely orchestrated by the Nazis themselves. And so the Nazis built up a certain amount of demand, you might say, for their particular kind of order by having Nazis take to the streets and beat people up. Of course, not indicating that they were Nazis. The Nazis, in effect, were saying, look at the disorder, society is breaking down, we need somebody to establish strong order to keep things from getting completely out of hand. So in 1932, Hitler ran again on this sort of platform. He said, politicians have ruined the Reich. Here is one of his posters, and talking about various choices that people had. He thought that basically he ran as a unifier. He said, there are all these political divisions. I will unify Germany. In fact, the state is this organic unity. We must all pledge allegiance to the state. To achieve that unity, we have to get beyond politics. He was trying to run as a post-partisan figure, and he championed a one-party state. the party of a great heroic nation. So he made no bones about the fact that the Nazi Party was to be all-encompassing. It was the German party. Now, there were other aspects to this. Notice here, out of the swastika, the symbol of the Nazi Party, one, okay, unity, das Volk, the people, okay, are to be one under the banner of National Socialism. It was also a government of artists. This is something that strikes us as odd. It's certainly not what we identify with Nazism. But he was inspired by Wagner and his grand operas, this vision of everything together. And Hitler was nothing if not a grand artist in this kind of scale, who would put on these rallies with dramatic speeches, dramatic lighting. They were orchestrated very carefully to achieve a certain effect. Although he was running on a socialist platform, by this point, he largely left the economy alone. He said, do you think I should be so mad as to destroy Germany's economy? And so the economic aspects of this were really downplayed and put aside. He wanted fundamentally to change the relationship between man and the state. We are socializing the people, he said. And so his goal was to develop a kind of unity through a socialization, a collectivization, an overcoming of the political divisions that he saw as resulting from individualism. Well, on August 10th, he sent his men into the street and he beat a communist who was there holding a communist placard to death in front of his family. Now, that was bad enough, but then Hitler published a defense of the murder. Okay, now that's a rather remarkable thing. In the November elections, not long after that, the Nazis won 33% of the vote. The communists won 100 seats, about half the power of the Nazis, but between the two of them, they actually had a majority. And so Hitler became chancellor on January 30th, 1933. And here he is, ascending to the chancellorship, being greeted by von Hindenburg. Here are some of the campaign posters from 1932. Women for Hitler, a free Germany. Here, you know, this, well, what is that bird?
An eagle.
An eagle, I guess, yeah, as the symbol, but this black eagle becomes the symbol of the Nazi Party, in addition to the swastika. Now, here were the results of the election. The areas in red voted for Hitler, to the extent that they are red. The green areas voted for the opposition. So you can see Bavaria was not, the large cities of the industrial area did not go for Hitler. This area did not. It was really the more rural areas that went heavily for Hitler. But it was enough to give him, well, 33%, which was enough to allow him to form a coalition. Here he is addressing the German people, and he was very good at doing that kind of thing. Here you see a grand torchlight parade that accompanied his ascension to power. He was good at orchestrating these kinds of things. My grandfather had a shortwave radio and used to listen to Hitler's speeches, even though he didn't speak German. I mean, I had one grandfather who did speak German, but this was the one who didn't. And he said, it didn't matter. It was so dramatic that he would listen just for the theater of the thing, even though he didn't really understand quite what was going on. Now, that's not to say he liked it, but he said, basically, long before people realized something terrible was about to descend on the United States and Western Europe in general, he realized there's something dramatically new here, something that is orchestrated in a way that people have never seen before. Well, on February 27th, 1933, the Reichstag burned to the ground. It was on fire. They blamed the communists. In fact, almost certainly Nazis were behind this. The Reichstag was, in effect, Congress. It was the representative body. In March 1933, Hitler won 44% of the vote, and the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act. Now, this is, I think, one of the most remarkable developments in the history of this period. What the Reichstag did is give all legislative power to Hitler and his cabinet. Now, why did they do it? They essentially voted themselves out of business. So why would you, as a congressman, basically, as a member of a legislative body, basically give up all your power and turn it over to this leader and his cabinet?
Were they afraid of being, like, I guess, persecuted by him and his, like, people in some way? Were the Gestapo already around, or the brown shirts?
Yeah, we'll get to that in a moment. Yes, they were. So here's one thing, fear, right? This person has enough power that you're afraid. And we'll get to that in a moment. But yes, there was good reason for that fear. Other things, yeah.
Well, the Reichstag just burned down, and then Hitler says the communists did this, and they're like, our country is divided, we're incapable of leading them, and we need somebody to take our country through this perilous time.
Ah, good. So some people are just there because, look, the divisions are such that, as it were, the capital has just burned down. We're in deep trouble. We need somebody to reestablish order. So undoubtedly many people thought of this as a temporary measure, sort of like granting the government temporary powers to get us through this crisis. Of course, they weren't temporary. Hitler then said to the socialists who had backed this, and now I have no further need of you. How was the Congress ever going to regain its power and declare the emergency over? So it was, to some degree, enacted as an emergency measure, but there was no criterion for removing the conditions of the emergency. What else might have motivated something? After all, the socialists did back Hitler, even those from parties that were not the Nazi party. Why did they do it?
He's good at giving speeches. He's good at getting people to follow him. You said yourself.
Good.
Him.
All right, he's very good at getting public opinion on his side. So to some extent they're building on, they may themselves be convinced by the speeches, or they may look at the people and say the people are being convinced by the speeches, so we better go along. So yes, to some extent it's like, wow, the popular will seems to be on his side. Yeah.
Well, the last bullet point you have implies that that's a betrayal because they're part of a coalition that votes for him, so did they think it would cement their power?
Yes, exactly. They thought, yes, we don't know about this guy who's leading the movement, but nevertheless we vaguely associate with this movement, and so we'll grant this, we'll allow this to happen, and we'll take the power back from Hitler at a time when it seems right. Their thought is, yes, the will of the people seem to be on his side, it's an emergency situation, we'll grant this, but no problem, we'll push him aside as soon as the time is right. And of course, they really severely underestimated him and the ruthlessness with which he would pursue his agenda. Now, one of the first things he did is ban the Communist Party. By July, in fact, the Nazi Party was the only legal party. All the other parties were banned. The labor unions were brought under Nazi control. And the national government assumed all regional authority. So not only was all the power in the national government concentrated in the hands of Hitler and his cabinet, all of the regional governments, all of the things that gave it a kind of federal structure were abolished so that the national government was in control of everything. At this point, Goering said, the law and the will of the Führer, the leader, are one. Okay? There was really no way for anybody else to have any authority at any level in the German system except for Hitler himself. And notice all of this has happened within a few months. It's a very, very rapid process. Now, you talked about this mechanism of fear. There were three competing security systems that helped to instill that fear and that sense of order. It was really a kind of institutionalized Darwinism, some historians have said. He pitted these against each other and let the strongest survive. The first one was the SA, the brown shirts. The second, the SS, the black shirts. Finally, the Gestapo. Now, the first, and by the way, notice the way Hitler dressed throughout. Always in a military uniform, always with an iron cross.
Yeah, what's up with dictators doing that? Honestly, that's really weird, yet everyone seems like cool with it.
Yeah, right.
Like Mussolini dressed in a military uniform, like, dude, why? Like, that's like me dressing up for something that, like that's like Obama showing up in like an army uniform with a parachute. Like, it's just weird. I don't get it.
Yeah, right. Why? I mean, it is still popular today among dictators. Why did they do it? Yeah.
Well, at the time, militarism was becoming something that was used as a tool because nationalism was really heavy. So the idea of having a very militaristic, strong, paternalistic leader was something that was heavily used, and having a uniform that matched that was an instance of showing said power. Not only that, but the representation of such a thing would kind of motivate people to act.
But even if like they're never in the military, it seems like a lie. Like it just seems silly to me. I guess.
Right, why wouldn't people see through it? Yeah, now Hitler at least had been in the military, he had served in World War I, he had actually earned that Iron Cross. That wasn't an affectation. He got, in effect, the German Medal of Honor. Right. And so, in Hitler's case, there was a reality to it. But you're right, in many of these cases, there isn't.
Even Kim Jong-il, didn't he dress up kind of military?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like, it's just...
And what's the point of all that? Part of it is this militarism, this patriotism, part of it is a show of force, right? I am in command of the army. Now here we think it would be very inappropriate for a president, unless he actually was, like Eisenhower, let's say, the commander of the Supreme Forces, to dress that way. But in these countries, it's taken as a show of strength. And here it was a very specific, I think, attempt to say, yeah, look, I'm a military hero, and I have people on my side who are willing to establish order through violence. Yeah.
Well, we think of it as inappropriate here because we have a government in which the civilian government is in charge of the military. By wearing a military uniform, you're making the statement that you are power. There is no check and balance on your control of the military. You are the military.
That's exactly right. Here we have this idea of different power centers that can balance each other out. We don't want the civilian leader to be the military leader. I mean, the president is commander-in-chief, so in a sense that's right, but we want the military and the civilian government to be separated, just as we want the legislative power, the executive power, and the judicial power within the civilian government to be separated. Hitler's going in exactly the opposite direction. He wants all power concentrated in one place, namely himself. And so, to some extent, he wants to be the head of government and also the head of the military, and he wants the symbolism to indicate that very explicitly. Now, what were these three groups? The SA was a group called the Brown Shirts, pictured here. They were run by a man named Röhm. There were over 1 million people in the SA by the fall of 1933, and another 3.5 million in reserve. This was a huge force. It was like a military, but a military used strictly for domestic purposes. It was a domestic army. And they engaged in brutal and open street violence against people who were viewed as the enemies of the Nazi Party. At some point, they were getting too powerful. And so by July of the next year, in particular, Hitler realized that Röhm was himself becoming a very powerful figure who had a huge force under his command. Hitler thought this was a threat to himself, and so he staged the Night of the Long Knives, in which Röhm, Strasser, other political opponents were shot. There were 5,000 to 7,000 victims. Most shot, some had their throats slit in the middle of the night. It really was the sort of thing where under the cover of darkness, Nazis went out and killed the leadership of the SA, all in one night, so that no one could communicate with the others and warn them about what was happening. This is one of the events that inspired Stalin, to make him realize, wait a minute, I don't have to play these mean girls type games. I can actually just slit their throats. I can just shoot them. Really, until then, Stalin thought the international outcry from such an event would be so great, I wouldn't dare it. Then he saw Hitler do this and realized, oh, there are no consequences to this. No one will do anything. And it was just after this that Stalin began his great purges. The SS was the second group. Heinrich Himmler was the head of this. They were called the Black Shirts. They dressed in a different kind of uniform. And they were a highly trained elite. By the end of 1933, there were 52,000 of those. Remember, as opposed to the 4.5 million in the SA, active and in reserve. So this was a much smaller group, but a much more serious group, whose loyalty was much more severely tested than basically the ruffians who made up the SA. And then finally, the most elite group was the Gestapo. They were Hitler's personal guard. Here you see them running with dogs after someone they take to be a threat to the power of the Nazi Party. By March 1933, so really just days after the Reichstag fire, Hitler opened up the first concentration camp at Dachau. There were 5,000 prisoners initially. It was to grow much larger by the end of the war. They were charged with suspicion of activities inimical to the state. And so they were there for a variety of reasons, but mostly these were political prisoners. This was not yet the extermination effort to get rid of Jews, homosexuals, the handicapped, etc., etc. These were people who were thought to be political enemies of the party. And they were run very, very strictly. There were all sorts of very severe punishments, flogging, death penalty for a variety of offenses. These things were offenses within the camps. Holding meetings, making speeches, forming cliques. Notice that. You guys have been talking a lot together. Okay. Loitering, just hanging out, collecting information about the camps. Okay. Those are incredibly invasive and incredibly vague crimes. And they were ones that would lead to the death penalty for anybody in these camps. All right, well, that's the part of last week's that I didn't get to. I want to turn now to the paralysis that gripped Western Europe as Hitler turns his attention outside Germany. Churchill's motto in this book, The Gathering Storm, is how the English-speaking peoples, through their unwisdom, carelessness, and good nature, allowed the wicked to reign. And that's, in a sense, his story. Look, we were good people. We weren't very smart. We were careless. And look what we did. We set up the conditions for another world war. How was it possible? Now, it's not just Churchill who was amazed by that. The Nazis themselves were amazed by the success of what they were able to pull off. Goebbels, the PR chairman, basically, of the Nazi Party, in a briefing in April 1940, expressed his own amazement at what had taken place during the 1930s. The 1930s that the poet W.H. Auden wrote about as a low, dishonest decade. He says, up to now we've succeeded in leaving the enemy in the dark concerning Germany's real goals. Just as before 1932, our domestic foes never saw where we were going or that our oath of legality was just a trick. We wanted to come to power legally, but we did not want to use power legally. He said they could have suppressed us. They could have arrested a couple of us in 1925, and that would have been that, the end. No, they've led us through the danger zone. That's exactly how it was in foreign policy too. In 1933, a French premier ought to have said it. If I had been the French premier, I would have said it. The new Reich Chancellor is the man who wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle. This is a work in which he really lays out his plan for European and then world conquest, which says this and that. This man cannot be tolerated in our vicinity. Either he disappears or we march. But they didn't do it. They left us alone. They let us slip through the risky zone, and we were able to sail around all dangerous reefs. And when we were done and well armed, better than they, then they started the war. And so here is Goering basically saying, we're up against a bunch of crazy men. When we were weak, when they could have snuffed us out easily, they didn't do it, even though we told them in our publications exactly what we intended to do. Then once we got strong, and in fact stronger than they were, so they were in a position of weakness, then they decided to pick a fight with us. They're crazy. And that is in effect the story that Churchill tries to tell. Now, what was this plan that was laid out in Mein Kampf? I've talked about some of the ideas last time, but there he also tells you exactly what he's going to do. Here's the first part of the plan. Gain control of Germany. Well, by middle of 1933, done. Okay, destroy the Versailles Treaty. And that's what he proceeds to do next. Item after item, he basically says, I will take back for Germany what has been deprived from us in the Treaty of Versailles. He wants to make Germany the chief power of Central Europe. And indeed, by the end of the 1930s, he's done it. He wants to destroy the Soviet Union. Now, that's something that was much more difficult, much trickier. And it turns out to be his ruin. But, nevertheless, that's the next step of the plan. Stalin was astounded when Germany attacked the Soviet Union. He shouldn't have been. That was part of the book. If he had read Mein Kampf, he should have known that's the next thing to be coming. He wanted to establish a continental empire. And then finally, he says, he predicts in about 50 years, after he has departed from the scene, but his successors have taken over, then he says Germany will have to fight the United States for world domination. Well, as we'll see, he didn't follow that part of the plan. It was very important, the way he laid out the map in Mein Kampf, that the United States be kept out of the war in Europe, until he had consolidated power and defeated the Soviet Union. One of his cardinal mistakes, basically, was to get involved in a war against the United States. But, yes, how did all this come about? Here is a photograph that Roy has already shown you. This is Dr. Solomon taking a picture of key people. What are they doing? They're negotiating the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And what was that? Well, it was a treaty in 1928 that outlawed war. People at the end of the First World War said that was really bad. We mustn't let it happen again. Let's pass a law against it. And they did. Okay, here was Article 1. The high contracting parties solemnly declare in the names of their respective peoples that they condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and renounce it as an instrument of national policy in their relations with one another. Article 2. They agree that the settlement and solution of all disputes or conflicts of whatever nature or whatever origin shall never be sought except by peaceful means. So, there you have it. War is against the law. Now, tell me what the results of that are. Yeah.
War's just against the law for people who follow that law. Like, so, just like whenever you try to disarm or anything, only the people that follow that rule that applies to, that's generally the good guys anyway. So basically you're just weakening countries that could, like, for instance, Germany's going to get stronger while other countries just don't prepare for what's coming.
Good. Okay, excellent.
Like, by the beginning of World War II, like, the U.S. was their military was nothing. compared to what it should have been, I guess, to prepare for that, or in general.
Okay, good, yes. You might have seen the bumper sticker. If guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. Or you might say, if war is outlawed, only outlaws will fight wars. And you might think, well, that's fine, they can fight each other. But no, that's not the idea. Trotsky at one point said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Okay? It will come to you. And indeed, to the extent that you think it's now against the law, we don't have to worry about it, you start disarming, and that's just what the countries of Europe and the United States did, and left themselves highly vulnerable. Yes?
But doesn't this give legality to changing isolationism into interventionism?
Okay, good. There's another thing it does. It does say, wait a minute, war is against the law, but they do agree that they will seek resolution of conflicts through peaceful means. But that does have one important consequence, which is that people who don't do that, right, are breaking the law. Now, that means if I invade your country, I am guilty of violating an international law, and that allows other people to take action. So from one point of view, this seems ridiculous. It's sort of like, wait a minute, you're passing a law against war? That's absurd. I mean, it's already against the law to kill people. And so if an army comes in and invades, you really think they're going to be dissuaded by this? And it encourages people to this stance of appeasement and weakness and disarmament. But on the other hand, it does give some legal foundation for action against acts of aggression. And indeed later, much later, at the end of the war, when people are prosecuted for war crimes, they are in many cases prosecuted under this. For being aggression now becomes something that is punishable under international law. So I don't want to say all the effects of this are bad. There's some very important and powerful positive effects. Of course, what you say also indicates that there can be a negative effect. This can actually lead people to say, well, wait a minute, now, who am I? The world police? South Park movies come to mind. But I can't repeat here the slogan from that movie. But anyway, the idea is sort of, well, yeah, now, okay, it's against the law. Well, who gets to enforce the law? The idea of Wilson and others at the end of the war was the League of Nations. The international community will band together. But the United States Senate never ratified the treaty. It was weak as a result of American non-involvement, but also for other reasons. The Senate didn't ratify it, partly because they thought it was weak and would not work. In any case, this pact had some, from one point of view, little effect. Japan invaded Manchuria already in 1931, just 3 years later. Okay, nobody did much of anything. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. Nobody did much of anything. Germany seized the Rhineland. Austria, Czechoslovakia. This was between 1938, not 1839. Sorry about that typo. But it did form the basis for legal actions, and it formed the basis for intervention to try to prevent this in response, even if Europe took a while to actually start intervening and mobilizing. Now, you pointed out it would tempt people to disarm, and that's just what Europe began to do. The Prime Minister of England the position was traded back and forth between MacDonald and Baldwin throughout this period as the parties were in close competition, and it sort of sometimes went one way, sometimes another. At one point, MacDonald was Prime Minister and proposed the Mcconnell Plan. Here was the plan: to reduce the French army from 500,000 to 200,000. In other words, reduce it by 60%. Allow the Germans to increase to 200,000. They already had over 1 million in reserve. So essentially allow the Germans to achieve parity with the French army. It would restrict all new guns to 4.2 inches. It would reduce air forces to 500 planes. Churchill described it this way: it was like being smothered by a feather bed.
It's so stupid.
In any case, this was offering huge concessions to Hitler, basically saying, we've essentially restricted you to a very weak army, to a very weak navy, to no air force at all, but guess what? We'll allow you parity with France, and in Britain we'll also reduce forces to try to get us down to the same level. Now Hitler, sensing this, the German generals, by the way, were saying, take it, this is a fantastic deal. We get parity with France, we get parity with Britain, this is excellent. Hitler ignored their advice. He said, this is an insult, okay? He rejected it. He withdrew from the Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations. Now, what would you do if you offered this? You basically said, yeah, we said you couldn't really have an army or navy or air force, and that we would have much, but tell you what, we'll let you have parity with us. And then you're turned down. They say, that's an insult, we won't do it. What would you do?
You'd be like, screw you, Hitler, okay, like, whatever, we'll just build up our forces too.
Good, you might say...
That's a logical, way of doing it, but I don't think it's how it comes about.
You might think it's logical to say, aha, wait a minute, if you're not willing to accept equality, you must be seeking greater strength. We better strengthen up. That's the opposite of what they did. They offered more. Yeah.
But this is the 1930s, so deterrence by denial isn't necessarily going to work when governments
Right.
are focusing on trying to, recover economically. They're not really like, oh, especially after World War I, a lot of them are afraid of war, but they don't think that anyone's going to be stupid enough to start one.
Okay, good. They're so horrified by World War I, the last thing they want is another war, and they can't believe anybody would be foolish enough to risk it. Exactly right. It's not just that they want to avoid it, and they're in denial. They think surely everybody else is in the same position, right? Surely nobody wants anything like that again.
So you think he's in the same position as you. You have a huge economic incentive to reduce your army. You say maybe we need a conciliatory gesture here?
Good. You're in the middle of the Great Depression, right? And armies are expensive. And so here's one way of saving money and improving the rest of your economy. Reduce these military expenditures and allow that money to be part of the civilian economy. So there's a huge economic pressure to do this. Can you think of other reasons why people have been tempted to go down this path of disarmament, of negotiation, of appeasement?
I mean, it's easier than being, strong and saying, no, if you do this, we're going to go to war. It's much
Right.
easier to say, well, we'll just let this one slide.
Okay,
Because
good.
honestly, going to war is costly and kills people, and being ready to do that, is
Okay,
a
good.
difficult decision to make.
Exactly. This is, in a sense, the easy path. Surely we can all be reasonable, and so you make a greater offer. It's hard to fight a war. It's hard to even prepare. It's expensive. It's difficult. Yeah.
They thought if they appeased Hitler, he would stop trying to gain more power.
Good. They thought his demands could be satisfied, and if you satisfied them, that would be the end of it. And so at each stage, they're thinking, well, if we just do this one thing, right, then it'll all be over. And of course, as soon as you gave in on one thing, then Hitler would demand the next. But still, they thought at each stage that was going to be the last.
It also kind of makes me think of a quote that's actually about the Holocaust, and it talks about when they first came for the Jews, I did not care because I was not Jewish, so and etc.
Right.
etc. So the idea of when they first went for Poland or Czechoslovakia or all these various nations, several nations didn't care because it was like, well, this isn't me. I'm just going to turn a blind eye to it because I don't want to get involved. It's like when you see.
Yes.
When you're walking down the street and you see some guy get mugged, you could try and stop it, but a lot of times people just turn a blind eye and keep walking, even though they feel uncomfortable about it. They'd much rather stay safe than intervene.
Okay, good. At one point, we'll see Chamberlain saying, oh, these are faraway people of whom we know nothing. He's talking about the Czechs. I mean, that's not that far away from London. But still, this is far off. It doesn't affect us. Yes.
Well, when Hitler withdraws himself from these diplomatic bodies, the only recourse you have to have your terms accepted is to go in an aggressive move. And so if you want to continue to use diplomacy rather than warfare and violence, what can you do? You're sort of in a rock and a hard place. So the only way you can get him to accept your terms, now that he's rejected them, would be to go in and aggressively make him so.
Okay, good. He's building up his army. He's violating the terms of the treaty. What are you going to do about it? Essentially, he's like a bully who comes and demands your lunch money. And you say, all right, I'll give you, I know a lunch costs $2. Here's $2. He said, no, give it all to me. I want more. Okay? And this guy's strong, and he's getting stronger. And now are you going to fight? Or are you going to actually make more of an offer, right? Well, at least leave me some money for my lunch. No. Okay, at each point you think you can basically appease the bully, and it doesn't work. There's another factor, though, that nobody's pointed out, which I think is important. And if you think about what was going on in the minds of Chamberlain and Baldwin and Macdonald throughout this period, you realize it's playing a very big role. They realized that the Treaty of Versailles was unjust. They realized that what they imposed on Germany was unfair. And so what's Hitler doing? He's saying, give me back what used to be part of
And
Germany.
I guess they feel kind of bad, and they're like, yeah, well, okay.
Right, it's more like you've been the bully who robbed his lunch money, and now he's coming back and demanding it back, right? And you say, yeah, I did kind of rip you off, dude. So it's that sort of sense. They took advantage of Germany at the end of the war, and now they feel guilty about it. They realize, at a certain point, Lloyd George says, well, there was provocation. Well, there was provocation. The French and British hadn't done anything. To the extent that there was provocation, it was the Treaty of Versailles itself. And they realized, yeah, we're in a pretty weak moral position. And so to some extent, they felt guilty. They thought, yeah, we did something wrong at the end of World War I. We did treat Germany unfairly. He's got a point. These are Germans living in this place and that place. And after all, Germany is a major power. Why did we, insist on... And so in short, I think they thought, part of them sympathized with every demand Hitler was making. they realized, yeah, we were kind of unfair, weren't we? And so, sure, we'll let you have an army back. Yeah, we'll let you have a navy back. Yes, we'll let you have an air force, and so on and so forth. Now, there's something else that's playing on Hitler's mind as all of this goes on. Remember Forster, who said, I hate the idea of causes, and if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country. There was a sense that Hitler had, the rest of the German leadership didn't really have it, but he thought they are not going to fight. They are going to back down at every turn. They're not willing to stand up for their own countries. The Bloomsbury group was in general pacifist, as we've noticed. That pacifism in many cases, not among Forster and the other original members, but among their students, the people they influenced, actually turned into a loyalty to Stalin, and in many cases, Soviet espionage. So some of the people in the British leadership by this point were actually Stalinist spies. But there were other factors as well. Lansbury here was no spy, but in fact was the Labour Party leader. In June of 1933, as Hitler has consolidated his power, says, here's what I would do about it. I would close every recruiting station, disband the army, and disarm the air force. I would abolish the whole dreadful equipment of war and say to the world, do your worst. Well, they were about to. Okay. So there was a remarkable, I don't know, what do you call that? Naivete, yes, right. That is in addition to this sense of injustice, in addition to all of the other things we've described, a sense that really if you outlawed war, great, war would be a thing of the past. What would anybody do about it? Clement Attlee was another Labour Party leader. We're unalterably opposed to anything in the nature of rearmament. Okay? They were convinced that war was a thing of the past, that you didn't have to do it, and that you could set a moral example. Okay? Surely no one would attack us if we indicate that we are not going to be attacking anyone else. If we make clear our peaceful intentions, surely everyone will be peaceful toward us. That was the idea. The Times of London said about Hitler's speeches, which were highly aggressive, don't worry about them. They're purely intended for home consumption. This is just a way of unifying the German people and shoring up domestic support. The Oxford Union in 1933 debated the proposition that this House refuses in any circumstances to fight for king and country. And indeed, those in support of that resolution won by a margin of something like 2-1, okay, in the vote at the end of the debate. Hitler paid attention to that, and this was part of his argument with the German generals. The British will not fight, the French will not fight. They've already said they're not going to fight for king and country under any circumstances. Now that was wrong, but for a long time it was the right way to bet. So, in 1934, France and Britain and Italy all say they support Austrian independence. Italy, Hungary, and Austria signed the Rome Protocols to try to band together and form an alliance. Mussolini met with Hitler in Venice of that year, and his response was, non mi piace. Okay? He doesn't please me. He's a garrulous monk. So he didn't have any affection for Hitler at all, and in fact he then tried to form an alliance with Britain and France. Well, that was right around the time of the Night of the Long Knives, and within a few weeks the Germans had assassinated the Austrian Chancellor, Dollfuss, pictured there. Okay, so it wasn't just domestic opponents, the Chancellor of Austria was also murdered. Now, in December, there was a clash between Italian and Ethiopian soldiers at Walwal in Africa, and what happens then is that this forming alliance between Britain, France, Austria, Hungary, Italy, and so on, fell apart. Paul Johnson, a historian, puts it this way. It's of the essence of geopolitics to be able to distinguish between different degrees of evil. Mussolini attacked Ethiopia and tried to take it over. That was not good. There was no real justification for it. On the other hand, that is what fractured that alliance that was in the process of being formed. Now, in 1935, as time went on, Hitler won the Saar plebiscite. Remember, I said that rich coal-producing region was to be under French occupation for 15 years and then was to vote whether to be part of France or Germany. It overwhelmingly voted to be part of Germany. Hitler repudiated the Versailles Treaty formally on March 7th. June 18th, the Anglo-German Naval Treaty gives Germany a right to 35% of British naval strength and allows them parity in submarines. Remember, submarines were absolutely ruled out by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler had been building an air force against the treaty's terms on the sly, and by this point had parity with Britain, so had something as strong as the Royal Air Force. Italy prepared its invasion of Ethiopia. Hitler, violating the treaty again, instituted the military draft. Britain then warned Italy not to intervene in Africa and threatened sanctions. Well, Italy did attack Ethiopia before the end of the year. Lansbury resigned as head of the Labour Party. He was replaced by Attlee. And now, what happens? Well, Baldwin, as Prime Minister at this point, comes up with the following argument. This is Churchill's version of it, but there's some element of truth in this. The Prime Minister declared that sanctions meant war. Secondly, he was resolved there must be no war. Third, he decided upon sanctions. Okay? And in fact, they excluded oil, but included other kinds of goods. So, what the British government chose to do was impose economic sanctions on Italy. Now, there were a number of things Britain could have done. They could have done nothing. They could have said through diplomatic channels, we disapprove of this action. They could have said publicly, we disapprove. They could have imposed sanctions, as they did. They could have imposed stronger sanctions on things like oil that actually were used in the war effort. They could have themselves tried to intervene. They could have taken it to the League of Nations. They chose this form of sort of weak sanctions. Now, what kind of argument might you have given if you were in the British government at the time? This country that is making friendly overtures to you and wants to be an ally does this thing that you rightly think is incredibly unjust, attacking a country in Africa. What do you do? Yeah.
At the time, a lot of them would be along the lines of thinking, don't rock the boat. Like, if you want to have an ally in this instance, sometimes it's okay to not really look at the problems that they're doing.
Okay, good. So there's a strong temptation not to do anything at all, right? After all, this country is trying to ally itself with you. It's doing something appalling, but on the other hand, that alliance is valuable. It's sort of like this bully is offering to be your friend, but then starts picking on some weak kid, pounding him in the corner. What do? Right? If the alliance with the bully is strong enough, you might ignore the pounding of the weak kid, especially since that weak kid is far away, right? It's not as if Britain was well equipped to intervene in this conflict. Yeah.
I'm confused. Are you asking us what we as British
Well, all right, yes.
person would do, or are you asking us what we as person would like to think that we would do?
All right, good question. Am I asking you to put... Yeah, there's a philosophy joke about this kind of issue. Yeah, if Caesar had been in command in Korea, he would have used the atomic bomb, says one person. The other says, no, if Caesar had been in command in Korea, he would have used catapults. So is it like, yeah, so am I transporting you back and making you someone on the British cabinet who has the knowledge and personality of a British cabinet member? Or am I really transporting you with your current state of knowledge and everything back? It does make a big difference, right? And so you might think, yeah, what would I say now? That's different perhaps from what I would have said then. Yeah.
I mean, even if you're asking us about what, if we didn't have the knowledge, but if we had our personality and our moral system, what we were doing, you're still asking us for what we think as an ideal, as our idealization of ourselves.
Right, exactly. Well, good. Your idealized self, your better self, what would you, given what you know now and your present predilections and so on, what would you advise in this kind of setting? After all, this isn't just some abstract hypothetical situation from the distant past. Mm-hmm. This kind of thing faces governments all the time.
Well, I mean, the British shouldn't have probably been allied with Italy in the first place, because they know what type of person Mussolini is. They know that he's fascist, right?
Oh, right. He is, yeah, I mean, they know what Mussolini is, and he is beating up with a kid on the far corner of the playground.
The principle of the thing, like, you don't, if you're, a Western European country like Britain, you shouldn't ally with a fascist country that has an agenda that's very obvious, like, not a good one.
Not a good one. Ah, okay, like, good. So there's an argument. Forget about the alliance.
Yeah.
It's not, yeah.
No country can exist as a moral construct. Like the U.S. does this. You're talking about like only the British government does it. We support dictators in the Middle East and ensure a stable oil supply all the time. I don't know. Like it's hard for me to separate from this.
Okay, good. The idealist says, look, he's a bad guy. We don't want to ally with him anyway. The realist says, but yeah, at least he's a good guy or a bad guy who's on our side.
You don't compromise in foreign policy. You as a country do not do well.
Yeah, right. And so I think this is a compromise we have to make. Now, Basically, Churchill says what the British in fact chose was the worst of all these options. It didn't hamper the war effort. In fact, it hardened Italian resolve and stimulated their war spirit by making them angry. It estranged Italy and so drove Italy into an alliance with Hitler instead of with Britain and France. Part of the reason the sanctions didn't work is that they didn't apply to war materials. They only applied to things that would affect the average Italian. But what does Mussolini care whether the average Italian has some consumer good? And so basically, Johnson writes, to do sanctions in this way was folly. They don't work, they damage, infuriate, and embitter, but they don't really deter or frustrate an act of aggression. The only effect was to turn Mussolini into an enemy. Now, whether you think that's true of all sanctions, it did seem to be true with these sanctions, which didn't succeed in doing much of anything. Well, in 1936, Hitler went on through the list of things that he was violating the treaty terms for. He had remilitarized the Rhineland, pictured there. He admitted if the French had marched in, we wouldn't have been able to do anything. We'd have had to run back with our tail between our legs. His generals advised him not to do it, but Hitler turned out to be right. There was no response. Lloyd George said, yes, there was provocation. Well, what provocation? It could only have been the sense that the Treaty of Versailles itself had been an injustice. Britain began constructing radar stations on the coast. They did begin constructing a defense. On May 21st, Hitler said Germany has no interest in Austria. That's always a bad sign. Okay? In fact, on the 11th, he signed a pact with the Austrian government, promising not to interfere in their affairs. But 5 days later, he told the Nazi Party in Austria to step up their activities. He formed a formal alliance with Italy, and also one with Japan. Then the Civil War in Spain broke out, and I'm going to skip that in the interest of time, but that lends further complication. So, in 1938, he dismissed 18 generals for basically constantly opposing his ideas, and took command of the army himself. And then on March 11th, the Anschluss, the movement of German troops into Austria and the annexation of Austria. That was one of the things that was not permitted under the treaty. The Germans were not to unite with Austria. Hitler marched in and did that. Here you see an Austrian woman crying at the loss of her country. There was no actual military opposition. If you've ever seen the movie The Sound of Music, this is what takes place near the end of The Sound of Music. It was the end of Austria as a country until the end of the Second World War. And then in 1938, a crisis in Czechoslovakia. There are German-speaking areas who were taken away from Germany and given to Czechoslovakia when it was formed at the end of the First World War. In particular, people in the Sudetenland were ethnically German and spoke Germans. They demanded independence, and the leader of the Sudeten fled to Germany. Well, here's another international crisis. Hitler is demanding that something be done about these Germans inside Czechoslovakia to protect their right to self-determination. Chamberlain, who is then the prime minister, flies to Munich to negotiate with him. He comes back saying, here was a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word. And so he trusts Hitler completely. At the end of September was the Munich conference. And there was an agreement reached that Hitler could have the Sudetenland, but otherwise would leave territory in Europe alone. Chamberlain came back saying, I believe that this is peace for our time. Hitler publicly said, this is the last territorial claim I would have to make in Europe. Privately, he said, our opponents are little worms. We can take anything we want. And here gives you an idea. These areas in green were the Sudetenland, where there were a lot of ethnic and German-speaking peoples. That is, ethnically German people. That was the territory that was really under discussion. You can see it's actually a very significant part of what today is the Czech Republic. There is the agreement being reached. Chamberlain came back and gave a speech. How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. I am myself a man of peace to the depths of my soul. Faraway people. London to Prague is about 600 miles. It's just slightly longer than the distance between Austin and Atlanta. Okay? Distant peoples of whom we know nothing. In any case, he comes back holding up the agreement saying, I have secured peace in our time. Now, this was an incredible missed opportunity. The German generals were preparing to arrest Hitler. That's why he had gotten rid of 18 of them, but the others were plotting against him too. They were convinced that France and Germany, France and Britain would strike and defeat Germany easily at this point. But Hitler again proved to be right. Now they were astounded, and Hitler became the undisputed master. The generals at this point said, well, all right, we've been wrong time and time again. You're right, our opponents are little worms. There's nothing we can do. Churchill was one of the few people who really saw this as a defeat. His reaction, we've sustained a total and unmitigated defeat. And it really was a turning point. Now conclude with this. Why was it a turning point? Because those areas of Czechoslovakia were in fact the home of the Skoda Works. That was the second largest munitions area in Europe. We don't think of it being the case today, but the Czech army at the time was the second most powerful army in Europe. Britain and France and Czechoslovakia together were far stronger than Germany. But Germany and Czechoslovakia together were significantly stronger than Britain and France combined. So this was a huge piece to transfer from one side of the board to the other. The Czech army was in fact quite large. The Skoda Works were capable of turning out immense quantities of military equipment. It was in a mining region, so it was sort of self-sufficient in terms of resources. And so all of a sudden, after this, Hitler was now in a position of strength. Britain and France together were significantly weak. Next week, we'll look at how this actually turns into war.